Hello, welcome to yet another edition of the Digital Rights Africa podcast, where we discuss everything data protection and privacy, cybersecurity issues, child online protection issues, and intellectual property rights in Africa. Today, we're going to be talking about child online safety in Africa. And I have with us someone who works in Australia who will be sharing her experience in the space with us. She is by name Dr. Rys Farthing, who's the Director of Children's Protection at the Reset Tech Australia institution. Dr. Farthing, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to be here.
Yes, you have been doing quite a lot of work on online child safety. It's one of the areas where, for us at Africa Digital Rights Hub, it's extremely important, but we do not see a lot happening in Africa around that. From your experience, what do you think could be contributing to some of these challenges that we're facing on the continent?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big problems is that when you look at child online protection or, the safety of children in the online environment, it's just such a broad issue and there are so many sort of complex experiences that young people have that are both, risks and opportunities. And it can be difficult, I think, to find a way in, particularly from a sort of regulatory and policy perspective. And there's multiple approaches. And I think that sometimes a big barrier can be, if you're at the start of a process, you just think, oh my God, this issue is so big and so complex.
Yeah.
And it's discouraging for policymakers, for regulators, and also for legislators to work on. But I think from the international environment now, there have been a couple of really positive regulatory steps and regulatory moves made across the world in Australia, in Europe, and also in California that I think provide models of policy that regulators and policymakers can now look at. But I think what's going to be really interesting over the next few years is watching how these jurisdictions and these regions marry up these different approaches, because some are better for some issues, some are better for others. And
Can you share with us a little insight on some of these developments across the globe and then narrow down on what Australia is doing? Because Australia has been leading a lot around children's online protection in these areas, and it would be good to just give us in depth.
Yeah, sure. So I think, as you mentioned, Australia was an early leader in this space, and way back in 2015 we passed our first, what became Online Safety Act. It was called the Enhancing Children's Safety Online legislation. So we passed a piece of law, and I think, as far as I'm aware, that was the first piece of law that said this is about safety online and it affects children and young people. So we were early movers in this space. Because of the nature of the issue that legislation initially was starting to address, and because it was an early piece of legislation, we looked at exclusively child bullying. That was the first piece.
Okay.
And there was a sort of big focus that actually in Australia at that time there was a big issue. People were seeing that their children were experiencing bullying. Children were reporting this, and there were a couple of big incidents that I think really sort of swelled the pressure. So we passed this legislation, and what this legislation did it took a content and takedown approach. So it looked at how publishers used to deal with issues like defamation, like if something goes wrong, you take it down and you correct the issue. That was the approach. And when you think about how society in general, whether it's schools, families, anyone deals with child
challenges,
bullying that also matches, because when you think about bullying as a specific issue, one of the unique things about that is that the victims are children, but also the perpetrators are children and young people. So if you think about how you deal with bullying, normally it's like in a school, in a family, it's like, oi, you two, what's going on? You find out what's going on, you're like, stop it, and
you reprimand someone, yes.
Take down any evidence of the bullying, that sort of thing. So we had a sort of online safety bill that took that approach, and what that implemented was we set up a in Australia, a public-facing complaints facility.
Yeah.
So that families, children, schools, anyone could make a complaint that there was bullying happening and that there was this content online that was part of a bullying incident. We then had an e-safety regulator who was established under this Act, so an independent online safety regulator whose purpose was to investigate these complaints around child online bullying and say, okay, yes, we found out this is a valid complaint, and then they were given powers to be able to ask companies to take down content within certain time frames. And so we got a sort of take down and content focus because we started with bullying. Over time, Australia's legislation added, from child bullying, we were like, okay, well, what about other things? Image-based abuse, child sexual abuse material, adult-based abuse got added to that. So we added types of content, but we really had this sort of content and takedown focus because that was our law. Now, alongside that, our online safety regulator, that Office of the E-Safety Commissioner that was set up under that initial law, has been working to try and broaden that out, to try and look at systems and processes. So not just content takedown, but what can you do around systems and processes as well to try and make the online environment more comprehensively safe for children and young people. And they came up with a safety by design framework and a whole bunch of guidelines and toolkits alongside that, which are brilliant. But in the Australian context, they're all voluntary. It's voluntary guidance and voluntary codes. Up until 2020, I should say, when we updated our Act. Okay. And we've now implemented some slightly stronger pieces around that sort of systems-based, that sort of safety by design focus. We're expecting anyone who works any company that works in Australia that deals with children and young people, as internet service provider, etc., social media, to actually develop their own codes around what safety by design might mean for them. It's a weaker approach than we see in the rest of the world, but you can see how that sort of came up. We had this really strong regulatory focus on content and takedown, and we've been gradually building this systems and processes focus.
And do you think, building this process, leaving it to industry is really going to fix this problem, especially if they have their, bigger agendas that do not align with let's say, the government's position or value?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question. And we saw this is such a timely question as well. In October, so just a couple of months ago, in October 2020, we saw the first draft of the online safety codes that industry had drafted in response to the Online Safety Act. And they were demonstrably weak. So they weren't comprehensive, they weren't ambitious. And when we compare them to a newer approach to regulation that's happening, as I mentioned, in Europe and in California, where actually regulators write their own codes, actually you can see that where Australia pitched its online safety codes was here, because they were written by industry, where Europe and California pitched it was here. And you can see in black and white, like there's actual things where you can quantify the difference. So in Europe, so in the UK, in Ireland, in Sweden, in France, about to be in the whole of the EU, and also in California, the age at which companies that deal with children and young people's data are required to default their accounts to private is 18. So if you're under 18 and you open a new account on any social media platform, it defaults to private up until 18. In Australia, because industry wrote the code, they were like, defaulting to private, that's important to keep young people safe, isn't it? That's what we need to do. We'll do that up until 16. And so there's just multiple instances like that in the draft Australian code, where industry have set themselves lower standards than what are emerging global norms. And I think that's where we've almost got this interesting experiment happening, right? Australia has gone really strong on the content and takedown focus, and a bit sort of more collaborative and softer on the systems and processes. But the new legislations, the new approaches that are coming through from Europe, they're so strong on systems and processes. They're all about design. They're all about actually how do you use data? What have you got in place? What are your processes to deal with this? And the age-appropriate design code doesn't cover content at all, so it's
Yeah.
hard on systems and
Yes,
soft on
on
content.
content.
And so we've almost got this perfect experiment happening.
Yeah,
it's just
I think,
unfortunate.
so do you think Africa should sit back and watch and see how it goes? Or,
No.
or we need to jump into the maze with everybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's the perfect experiment from the science perspective, but it's an unethical experiment, right? I think that actually Africa and anyone who's a new entrant to this sort of regulatory space can sit back and learn from both of these approaches. They've both come from sort of a political path dependency from, Australia dealt with things the way we did, Europe dealt with things the way they did because of their regions. I think Africa's got this really unique opportunity to say, okay, well, what happens if we marry both of these approaches? What happens if we take a really strong content focus and marry that with a really strong systems and process focus? Actually, do we have a comprehensive framework then? I think in a lot of ways...
That's quite an interesting way to look at it, you know.
And Africa
and
really
that's
could be
precisely also because we're at the place where we can look and observe, the goods and the bads, coming from all sides of the globe, and then find our own right fit. Having said that, what role? So in the last season, I actually had the opportunity of talking to children on this platform, and then also parents of children on online child safety. And it was a very revealing experience. I spoke to children between the ages of, I believe, 9 and 16. And, clearly also from the parents' perspective, we realized that even as adults, these children, there are spaces in which they probably know a lot more than we do. They have a better understanding of themselves and how they should interact on these platforms. So do you think that when we are approaching these issues about child online safety from the comfort of our legislators' offices and as policymakers, as civil society organizations, we are doing enough to engage the children, get their views and involve them?
No, I mean, I think that firstly, when you speak to children and young people, it's incredibly rewarding and recharging, isn't it? You would have found that in your interviews.
Yes.
But I think that the more we engage children and young people, we do a couple of things. Firstly, we realise their right to participate. I mean, these are legislations, policies, regulations, whichever way they come in. These are rules that directly affect their world. So young people have the absolute right to participate in those discussions. This is a question about building the democratic world and modelling the type of citizenship for young people that we hope they have going forward.
And they're going to inherit the future, so why not get them involved now?
Oh, absolutely. So there's a sort of democratic question of we have to do this because we should. But also I think that there's a sort of pragmatic question. You just end up with better policy when you speak to children and young people because they can actually tell you where the issues are. They can tell you what they experience and they can tell you how they see their data being used. They can tell you where they sign into things, where they don't. And they understand actually what's going on in their lives because they're living it. And in that sense, there is no one who is a better expert at being a 13-year-old online than a 13-year-old who's online. And so if we want to make policies that are actually impactful, that work...
We need to talk to them.
Exactly.
Well, so, I mean, we are... I don't even know where to say we've begun something. And on the continent, we see that there's a lot which usually happens of disparate not just approaches, but even when you come into the regulatory and the legal and the policy and the stakeholder spaces, right? We have those that are talking about cybersecurity, and so they're talking about child online safety in some respects. So usually they're looking at issues like pornography, bullying, and the likes. Then we have the data protection regulators who are mandated under their laws to regulate personal data. And specifically under some of the laws, we have laws designating children as children's data as sensitive data, and so providing some level of requirements, some to the standard of the GDPR, but most slightly lower than the standard of the GDPR. And then we have government ministries or policymakers that are in charge of children. Okay, then we have the schools that fall within education sectors that are also in charge of educating children, and all of us. Then we have the CSOs like ourselves who are also trying to do something. But we are not talking together. You have experienced what is happening in the rest of the world. Have they really been able to find a solution around, you know, this complex ecosystem of different stakeholders? And how do we get them to talk to each other?
Yeah, I think that's a really, it's a poignant note. There are so many players in the ecosystem of child online safety, including children and young people and families. Yes. But also that breadth of other people involved who you mentioned, and getting them aligned is, you know, it's almost impossible. Like, it is such a tough ask. Wow. But, you know, I think it has to be done, and it really can be done. You can bring players together, you can align. There's a lot of both political appetite, but also a lot of popular appetite to get the digital world right for children and young people. It seems to be one of these cross-party issues. It seems to be something that people can come together around. So I think there's open doors when you start having those conversations around, look, we need to do something. The difficulty is making sure that everyone is aware that in their turf, whether it's cyber security or data protection or education, actually how important this issue is, and how it, you know, their agenda can't be fulfilled unless they also look at this. I think in terms of places where I've seen it done well, I think that's difficult. I think Australia is a smaller space, not necessarily geographically. I just mean we've got one government, multiple states. We can work with that. I think we're starting to see a coming together of players in that space. I think Europe's incredibly complex. They've got a lot of difficulties to work on doing this. I think that one of the things I'd love to see is Africa kind of leading the way of saying, actually, okay, we need to bring our data protection regulators together, we need to bring our education ministries together, and actually we need to bring our emerging online safety regulators into this space, because unless you can really bring everyone together,
and who should be leading something like that? Because always that's what, you know, everyone, when you speak to all these players, they all understand that we should be talking to each other. But then it's like, we're waiting for somebody to call us to the table. Who should really be leading this chat?
And there's that question of they, isn't it? We always go to like what they have to do. And you're like,
exactly.
Who's they? I basically think we need everyone involved in this, and in terms of leadership, it's whoever's ready to step up to the plate. Like, I think I see a lot of appetite in civil society organisations to really drive change in this agenda, and if that's where it's got to start, great, let's start with civil society. Let's actually join everyone up, bring as many partners as we can to the table and say, this is what needs to be done, who's on board, and let's do it. The other thing I think we need to remember in this mix is that the perfect can't be the enemy of the good. Like, in an ideal world, we would have every country, every element, every regulator, every policymaker involved. If you can't get that,
we should work with what we have.
Work with what you've got. Everyone who's involved has a small space, it's a small agenda that they can push forward to make safer for children online. Let's do that.
Yeah, and I think that this issue of bringing players together becomes even more complex when you start looking at it from the continental levels, right? Because we have these players locally, and usually that's how you're able to maybe get country level impact. But then when you expand it to the level of a continent, what should we be thinking about in how to address it? I don't know whether you have a solution, but...
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I've got a solution, but I think I can talk about having seen it happen in Europe, and it's starting to happen in the US. But I think what we saw in Europe was we got this this first ripple of change emerging from the UK with the age-appropriate design code. And once that sort of model was there, other data regulators were like, okay, this is a way we can look at children's safety online. This is what we need to do. And Ireland passed their fundamentals, their code, actually before the UK's code was in force, so there wasn't actually a gap. And then Sweden and France and the Netherlands came on board. And so you started to see this sort of regional wave, if you will, to the point where now the European Data Protection Board is saying, okay, actually we need a Europe-wide code because
this is necessary.
We need to harmonise this. We need to bring every European state up to the same place. And the European Commission is also implementing an age-appropriate design code. I'm not sure what Europe is complicated. The European Commission, European Data Protection Board, not 100% sure what they are. But we've seen this sort of European wave take place. In the US too, we've seen this. The US has, as you all know, big difficulties passing federal legislation. And so actually what we're seeing is the emergence of state-based legislation. So California has passed a bill. New York is looking at a slightly different but similar-ish bill at the moment, and there's campaigns in other states to go state by state until you create almost this American wave. And I wonder if that model, you tell me, might be something to look in Africa.
Now, I mean, just to, because I think our time is almost up, but I just want us, we did some research together where we noticed that the safety is online for some of the applications for children in Africa is not the same as the rest of the world. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the most telling pieces of research I've ever sort of been involved in. And what we looked at was Instagram, TikTok and WhatsApp. And so we looked at 3 sort of global platforms that purport to offer the same service all around the world. And then looked at actually, okay, if you're a child or a young person, what's the actual experience? How does that work for you? What does that look like? And we looked at things like the default age. At what age did you default to the highest privacy settings? And we found that in Europe, where, as I mentioned, we've got this wave of regulation happening where everyone has said you have to default accounts to private up until 18. That's what we saw. So when we looked at what 17-year-olds were being served in the UK, Germany, Slovenia and Finland, we found that all of those accounts defaulted to private up until 18. Then when we looked in Ghana, South Africa and Ethiopia, we found, it's not 18, it's 16.
I think it was 16 or something.
So again, you've got that thing of 17 and 18-year-olds right across the African continent being left unprotected. And I think those little gaps are exactly where regulation needs to step in, because industry hasn't stepped up and rolled out these child online protection features globally. They've rolled them out where regulators have demanded them. And then issued these slightly watered down versions in other regions. And I think
that
that's
also
unfair.
speaks to, it's unfair, but it also speaks to the weak regulatory regimes that we have on the continent, which is also why we've been calling for stronger, regimes to really help bridge some of these gaps. Like you said, even in Australia, when you leave industry, they will always leave that room that allows their businesses to thrive, but there's room for regulation and all of that. Thank you so much, Rys, for joining us. All too soon, our time is up, but I'm hoping that we can bring her back again, because I think there is still a lot of issues that needs to be discussed on this. As a take for me, I would say that for Africa, we have the opportunity to learn the ropes from the likes of Australia and Europe and the US, and to find the right fit for us. Definitely one of the things we need to recognize about child online safety is that there are a lot of players in the space and collaborators, and so we need to make sure that we get everybody in the space, particularly our children. Thank you once again for joining us on yet another edition of the Digital Rights Africa podcast, where we discuss everything data protection and privacy, child online protection, cybersecurity issues, and intellectual property rights in Africa. Join me again next time. Bye.